turned out that basically Hezbollah was a paper tiger. And Iran is really something of a paper tiger.
I would compare Iran with the Wizard of Oz. You pull back the curtain and there's a little old man, just not the threat that they wanted to be.
People, I think, who are kind of critical of the regime in Iran, very much looking at events in Syria and thinking, right, here's something that was long thought of as a status quo, all of a sudden being upended.
The Arab Spring didn't work. And now Syria's got a second chance, which is a wonderful thing.
All this, if you take it all into account, and of course Trump moving into the White House on the 20th of January, he's got senior people in the administration who are even more pro-Israel than the previous lot were. Is the annexation of the West Bank, which is something that Netanyahu has been flirting with for years, now going to happen? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast and this special look at what's next for the Middle East. Democracy in Syria, a ceasefire in Gaza, Iran on the brink, Israel unleashed, more unleashed, and then there's the Donald Trump factor. Could 2025 be the year the Middle East is completely rearranged? Well, to dig into all of this, I'm joined by two Channel 4 News foreign affairs heavyweights, Secunder Kermani and Jonathan Rugman. Welcome to you both. What surprised you most about the last 6 months? Jonathan, you first.
I think what surprised me most was the fall of the Assad regime in Syria in less than a fortnight. And when I covered it for Channel 4 News, I wrote a script and I said, well, I think the Iranians will rush to Assad's defense and the Russians will unleash their jets and do what they did in 2015 and push the rebels back. And what happened was that the advance was so quick, and I think the Iranians were so depleted and their allies Hezbollah, so depleted by Israeli attacks, that they didn't respond. And I think the Russians responded probably too late and made some...
They were busy elsewhere too.
They were busy elsewhere, but perhaps more to the point, at some point they decided that this guy in Damascus was no longer worth defending, perhaps. Did they really want to unleash another wave of airstrikes of the kind that they did in Aleppo in 2015. So that's really surprised me. And I think it's ending the year, for me at least, with a degree of hope, because I think that al-Jolani, the leader of this rebel insurgency, I mean, the word that's often used about him is that he's thoughtful. And he's had quite a long time to think. I mean, he's had years to sort of disassociate himself from al-Qaeda. And I think, having covered the Arab Spring in 2011, there was no second chance for those countries. They've all slipped back either into chaos or to a degree of authoritarianism. The Arab Spring didn't work. And now Syria's got a second chance, which is a wonderful thing.
And a unique thing in the region.
A unique thing. And because maybe 500,000 people have been killed in the intervening years, that is a serious, sobering wake-up call for Syrians as to whether they really want another civil war or whether they can actually pull off this second chance that they've now been given.
We'll look at what will happen to Syria in a minute, but just quickly, Sek, I mean, there was this extraordinary scene of Prime Minister Netanyahu standing not on the Golan Heights, but in the buffer zone that Israel moved into as soon as the Assad regime fell. And he gave a speech where he said, if it hadn't been for us taking on Hezbollah, there wouldn't have been this chain, and Iran, by the way, there wouldn't have been this chain reaction that led to the fall of the Assad regime, in a couple of weeks. Do you think he's right to take that claim?
Well, first, I mean, just underlining what Jonathan was talking about the speed and shock that this advance was met with. I was in Beirut just 2 days, basically, before the Assad regime fell, and flew back along with colleagues from the BBC, CNN, to my obvious...
You're covering yourself here. You're covering yourself. You left too early. But what you're saying is you had good reason to leave, because you thought they were going to hang on.
I mean, the consensus seemed to be that at least they'll be fighting around, if not Hama, then around Homs, if not Homs, then Damascus. But then, on reflection, you look back, for example, at events around the fall of Kabul in Afghanistan, and you think, well, really, when a force has momentum behind it, that things can just go very,
why
very,
do we
very
always
quickly.
get that wrong? Because we always think that these regimes that have been tyrannical, that have dug in, that have been there for years, surely they'll last a bit longer. I mean, I'm in your camp as well. I thought, we can wait this one out until the beginning of January, and we were wrong.
Absolutely.
Why do they collapse like a house of cards?
Well, I mean, it differs from place to place, doesn't it? But I mean, for the reasons that Jonathan was talking about, the kind of, and that you touched on, I mean, the blows that had been inflicted on the Iranian axis of resistance, as they call it, so have really been unprecedented. I mean, Hezbollah played such a key role in propping up the Assad regime, along with other Iranian militias or Iranian-backed militias, along with the Russians. And Hezbollah really took so many blows from Israel in the last few months. When I was there and talking to people in Hezbollah about the prospect of them going over to Syria to fight, when there was the possibility of still fighting back, one local Hezbollah official kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, they've got a government there. It was very clear they no longer saw this as their fight.
Let's talk about what this new Syria will look like, because if you look at the map, it's one hell of a patchwork of different interests and different rebel groups. Do we think that Mr. al-Jolani, who now calls himself by his original name, will actually end up being the leader of Syria by the end of 2025?
It really is too early to say. I mean, as I said earlier, I think he's thought this through. I think it's very interesting that he hasn't given the Russians an ultimatum to get out.
You think he will?
Well, I think actually he's playing quite a clever game, because what's happening at the moment is various delegations of governments are heading to Damascus and engaging with him, and he's taking all comers.
Yeah. And he's on a charm offensive. He's giving interviews to people.
He may feel he doesn't owe the West anything.
Yeah.
He was formerly with al-Qaeda himself, in spite of the West having paid hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to Syria over the last 10, 12 years. The Russians not doing that. But it's interesting that he hasn't kicked the Russians out, because the Russians pulverized Aleppo in 2015. They forced the rebels into a corner in northwest Syria. And even the Russians are still there. Even their base is still there, which tells you this is a man who's really taking his time and probably doesn't want to be duty bound to any particular camp. And I would include the Turks in that, who are often credited for having supported this rebel advance.
But if you look at him and try and imagine what he would be like in 2 or 3 months' time as a leader. So at the moment, he's giving interviews, to a couple of Western media organizations, and basically trying to go on this charm offensive. He's using his original name, not his nom de guerre. He's, he's still got the beard, but everything else about him is kind of clubbable, if you like, and someone the so-called West can do business with. But we know where he comes from. And we know that some of the people that have given their limbs and sacrificed in blood over the years will say, hang on a minute, this secular country, Syria, and it was very secular, that's not what we had in mind. We don't want men kissing in the streets or holding hands. We don't want, women behaving in a secular way. So what happens then?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, at the moment, as you say, Jolani, Ahmed al-Sharaa has been making really all the right noises, talking about respecting minorities' rights and going and, meeting delegations from the Alawites, from the Christians, from the Druze. I mean, I saw some incredible pictures shared on social media last night of, I think, Christmas celebrations in Homs, with a pit bull pumping hip-hop soundtrack.
Christian hip-hop.
Yeah, I suspect pit bull may be a believer.
But so what is he, when he sees those scenes, what does he think?
Well, I mean, it's a key question. I mean, he's obviously allowing that to happen, and importantly, people feel confident enough in their ability to go out and celebrate like that. I was watching his recent interview in which with Jeremy Byrne from the BBC, and they talked. Jeremy asked him about whether alcohol would be banned, and he kind of basically didn't want to answer, and just said, "I don't want to talk. These are legal issues that I don't have the right to talk about just yet." But I mean, for anyone who comes from any kind of political Islamist background, whether it's Muslim Brotherhood, let alone Al Qaeda, I mean,
booze is a no-go area.
Is a no-go area, and it's there are many Arab countries that were close allies of the West where booze was also illegal. But I mean, he will face pressures from both sides. He will face pressures from his own ground troops who want to see, if not, a kind of who will want to see at least some form of more austere Sharia-orientated society being created, because that is the ideological pool from which they have come from, and then others, minority groups, the West, who are pushing for a more secular society. So far, he seems to be making all the right noises in being open to kind of allowing people to pursue the kind of lifestyle that they want.
That said, I think the West and the World Bank's reconstruction budgets will be tied to an inclusive form of government. Yeah. You won't get the money if you don't.
And of course, mistakes were committed in Afghanistan after the fall of the last government with the Taliban in place. I mean, there people thought the Taliban would be would not be as severe as they were the first time they ran Afghanistan. They turned out to be even worse.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was there and spent a lot of time in the lead up to it and afterwards. I mean, and that was, it was very instructive because, there actually you had even members of the kind of Taliban who thought that they were going to be somewhat less strict in allowing female education.
And the pressure was too great.
Pressure was too great from certain wings within the group. Syria is such a different country, such a different historical and political context, and such a different patchwork of kind of groups living there, that I think, even if you look at Idlib province, where HTS has been in power, there have been reported problems of kind of Christians, for example, having properties confiscated in the past, although I saw that apparently perhaps that may have been kind of resolved more recently. But you didn't see those kind of restrictions on kind of women's education, for example. But I don't think we're ever talking about something like that developing, but will it be a democracy? Will it be a secular country? I think that's very much a question that we can't answer this yet.
And Jonathan, is the biggest kind of conflict within Syria the one between a very strict version of Islam and the kind of secular tradition that the Assads continued, or is it between all the different rival groups that have been flexing their muscles of late, or is it all that plus Turkey's influence, Israel's influence, and of course still perhaps in some form Iran's influence?
Well, there isn't a Syrian army as such. They've taken off their uniforms and they've sort of disappeared, and the rebels have let them disappear and said, we won't come after you unless you are in a major commanding position and committed atrocities and so on. So in a sense, the Syrian army embodied a kind of Alawite defense of the realm, and that no longer really exists. So to that extent, there is a bit of a free-for-all. But I can't emphasize this enough. I think if you've lost 500,000 people, you sober up. Yeah. You would hope that would be enough of a wake-up call. Look how long it took in Lebanon, decades of civil war before that finally.
But if you've lost those people, you also feel you have a right, an embalmed right to basically stake your claim on the future of your country. But I wonder if is there a danger, especially, the Israelis are bombing, Syria's military capacities because they don't want to have that fall into the wrong hands as a threat against them. Again, are these outside influences that are prodding the various factions of Syria in danger of creating something in the future that will impact negatively on everyone?
Yes, they are. And I think the destruction of the Syrian military by the Israelis, they say, I think the real reason is probably not to do with these rebels getting hold of those things. It's probably more about stopping the Iranians from having supply routes to Hezbollah, which is their bigger worry. And one has to question whether the Israeli military presence in the buffer zone beyond the Golan Heights, which they've occupied,
is going to be permanent or not.
It's going to be permanent or not. They say not. They say this is for our self-defense. But they've seen weakness and they've pounced. And the Israelis have taken advantage of that.
Okay, you mentioned the Israelis. Let's move on. Let's swiftly move on to Israel because it's a busy region with lots of things to discuss. Netanyahu was in such a weak position, even until a few months ago. I guess the low point was the day that those 6 hostages ended up dead. There were mass demonstrations against him. He had the trials looming. And now that he's actually appeared in court on the corruption trial, it has coincided with not just, the aftermath of the decapitation of Hezbollah, tick in his favor, the fall of the Assad regime, which he takes some responsibility for, very much a tick in his favor. Iran cowed, another tick in his favor. I bet you that if there were elections in Israel tomorrow, he would win.
Well, I mean,
Sec.
On the one hand, you have the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for him and for the former defense minister. You have Amnesty describing Israel's actions in Gaza as genocide, as well as the ongoing ICJ case around genocide. So on the one hand, which obviously Israel denies, but on the one hand you have Israel increasingly becoming something of a global pariah state under Netanyahu, but at the same time, from his perspective and from a right-wing Israeli perspective, he's scored, as you say, as you point to, formidable military success. I mean, for so long, the Israelis had worried that a direct confrontation with Iran would mean, an immensely destructive war with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah was meant to be better armed and equipped than many nation states. It turned out that basically Hezbollah was a paper tiger, and Iran is really something of a paper tiger. I mean, throughout the kind of last year and a couple of months, we've seen that really neither Iran or Hezbollah were interested in primarily escalating the conflict.
I mean, I would compare Iran with the Wizard of Oz. You pull back the curtain and there's a little old man, just not the threat that they wanted to be. And I think Ayatollah Khamenei, who's now in his mid-80s, is increasingly looking like a dinosaur who's sort of fighting yesterday's wars with his axis of resistance that's now been shattered. There's internal criticism in Iran. Why did we spend millions and millions propping up the Assad regime in Syria and he's gone in days, when we've got our own economic problems at home. So the Iranians are in a very bad place. They've
also pressure internally, right? So, I mean, we saw these demonstrations which have disappeared because of draconian measures against them, but that feeling of real disgust and distrust with the government, with the Ayatollahs, is still very much there.
And people, I think, who are kind of critical of the regime in Iran, very much looking at events in Syria and thinking, right, here's, something that was long thought of as a status quo, all of a sudden being upended and being done so rapidly and taking heart from that. And coming back to Netanyahu, though, I mean, interesting, I think within Israel, there is now a majority of people who want to see the war ended, who want to see a ceasefire deal of sorts done, because they want the hostages back. I think there's a substantial portion of the Israeli public who would be okay with the idea of going back to war at some stage,
but also
in the
Gaza is flat.
future.
I mean, Gaza is dressed in 1945 in terms of what's left of it.
You look at, particularly at the pictures of northern Gaza. I mean, it seems like there's nothing standing. I mean, we're talking about Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, Jabalia. I mean, it's why so many people are making allegations of ethnic cleansing, and even papers like Aretz and former defense ministers really making serious allegations like that.
But I just wondered whether all this, if you take it all into account, and of course Trump moving into the White House on the 20th of January. He's appointed Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel, someone who doesn't even acknowledge the existence of Palestinians and calls the West Bank Judea and Samaria. He's got senior people in the administration who are even more pro-Israel than the previous lot were. Is the annexation of the West Bank, which is something that Netanyahu has been flirting with for years, now going to happen? Is the resettlement of the Gaza Strip something which the settler element of the government wants now going to happen?
I think you're right about what you say, and Netanyahu has described Trump as the best American president Israel's ever had. But Trump is also capable of standing up to Netanyahu, and I think in a way that Biden hasn't.
Trump wants his day in the sun, wasn't he, on the South Front? He wants a deal done of some sort.
He wants deals all over the place. He wants a deal to end Ukraine. He wants this war in Gaza over with. There are American hostages still missing.
But could that vanity be a good thing for the Middle East? Could Trump's vanity about capturing that moment of history, rather like Clinton with Arafat and Rabin, and we know how that ended, on the South Lawn of the White House, could that actually translate into some real, into peaceful currency? I
don't think so, because I think you're right that the Israeli far right is emboldened by having Netanyahu. They are talking about returning settlements to Gaza. They are talking about more settlements in the West Bank. So, UN resolutions being sort of trampled into the dust. But what hasn't changed are the demographics, which the sheer fact of the matter is there are 5 million Palestinians. And are you seriously saying that they're going to be part of a unitary, larger Israeli state? And I think the problem, I mean, what might happen is that Trump tries to resurrect his plan for a Palestinian state, which was nurtured by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in the first Trump presidency. But the problem with that is it is essentially a Swiss cheese of sort of cantons, with Israeli settlements still there. So in a way, what's always been true for Netanyahu is that the status quo suits him actually quite fine, which is sort of making promises to the settlers, but not actually doing it, not committing to a Palestinian state, but telling.
So they're muddling through. Yeah.
I mean, figures in the Israeli far right, like the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, they are openly describing 2025 as the year of annexation of the West Bank. But I think when they're talking about annexation of the West Bank, even they are not at the moment talking about annexing the kind of the Palestinian majority cities like Jenin, Ramallah. But exactly what they're talking about is annexation of the settlements,
which is a formalization of what we have anyway. But it's a formalization of it, and another. I mean, they would say an encroachment on the idea of a unitary state with the Palestinians living in it, in a kind of apartheid system as second-class citizens. The Israelis would deny that. Or, just a kind of Swiss cheese, but with bigger holes, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. And
which the Palestinians won't accept.
Which, of course,
it's totally unviable. But also fundamentally, I mean, if you annex those settlements, you are killing off really. I mean, what already seems to be in its dying gasp, the idea of a two-state solution.
So what I find really intriguing, and you kind of touched on it with Trump, is, if that sort of Trump, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman axis, whatever you want to call it, nexus, link, handshake can be revived. And of course, Jared Kushner was crucial in terms of, making the Abraham Accords happen, getting cozy with the Saudis and so on, at a time, when that was tricky. I just wonder whether the Saudis will say, okay, there's a deal to be done with you, America, giving us security guarantees, with us recognizing Israel, but we absolutely need something viable for the Palestinians. And does Trump then say, this is the bigger prize? I could get the Nobel, if you hold out to Trump the idea of getting the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, even better than being on the cover of Time magazine.
Exactly, and because he's done that already, right? He's done that. This is the second time, twice now. This is the second time around. Yeah. But if you can say to him, look, Donald, this is what you need to do, 4 steps, but they include the Saudis going along with it. Will the Saudis play their part in that?
But I mean, look, Jonathan, you know much more about the Saudi calculations than I do, so I want to hear from that. But I mean, it seems to me that really the Saudis have been, I mean, that's really the offer that Biden has been trying to impress on the Israelis for
But the Israelis aren't buying it.
But the Israelis aren't buying it because Netanyahu comes out and says proudly, I'm the one who's prevented the creation of a Palestinian state. You've had the Israeli Knesset coming out and voting as a majority, including opposition figures, against the
and of course, there'll be people in Israel who'll say, if you create the Israeli state, as a Palestinian state after October the 7th, you're rewarding Hamas violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Saudi Arabia, you've got King Salman, who's in his late 80s. Yeah. As a younger man, he was in charge of raising funds for the Palestinian cause from wealthy Saudis. And his son, MBS, may care less about the Palestinians, but every Arab leader cares about the Palestinians to the extent that the Arab world, it's a young population. Most Saudis are under the age of 30. They're looking at their mobile phones. They're seeing what's going on in Gaza. And so even if their leaders may not care particularly, they know that their people do and that they therefore have to do something about it. Plus the fact that Saudi Arabia is custodian of the 2 holy mosques and therefore has to provide direction for the rest of the Islamic world. And I think, yes, the Saudis would love to strike a security deal with the United States. That's more important to them than Israel, frankly. They already exchanged technology with Israel. But the price just went up because Gaza has been so terrible, such a disaster, that the MBS cannot do a deal with the Israelis if they don't make a really significant commitment to a Palestinian state, which Netanyahu ain't going to do. And if he does, no one's going to believe him.
I agree with you 100%. Just finally and briefly, we've just got a couple of minutes left. Iran. Are the Ayatollahs still going to be in charge of Iran at the end of 2025? You first.
Well, Ayatollah Khamenei, now in his mid-80s, a really tired revolutionary. I mean, this has been going on since 1979. They are losing their legitimacy. They're losing their popularity. They've been embarrassed. They've witnessed the assassination of a Hamas leader. They've witnessed the killing of the Revolutionary Guard commander in Damascus. I wouldn't want to count them out. I mean, they still have oil wealth. And this may be the moment of weakness where they might actually be able to do a deal with Donald Trump, which might sound counterintuitive.
20 seconds.
I mean, on Iran, I think what's most likely, or the big thing to watch, is whether they make a push to create a nuclear bomb. Because if you're an Iranian Ayatollah right now, and you've seen the way the rest of the axis of resistance has been dismantled and destroyed, you must be thinking this is the only thing that can prop us up.
Okay, got to leave it there. Fascinating stuff. More to discuss. Secunder, Kermani, Jonathan Rugman, thanks to both of you. That's it from this edition of the Fourcast. Until next time, goodbye.